the afternoon meetings, afternoon press conferences, but after he started talking about injecting disinfectants and inserting lights into human beings to beat this virus, his staff members finally were able to get him to understand that these afternoon meetings were actually destroying his credibility and hurting his poll numbers. Something, of course, which we've been saying on Morning Joe for quite some time. But obviously got angry when we did. But so as we start this week, Jonathan, 80,000 deaths. You've got the head of the CDC self-quarantined, head of the FDA self-quarantined. You have Dr. Fauci, the best medical mind in this area, self-quarantined. You've got the president's, one of the president's closest aides, Stephen Miller, self-quarantined. You have the vice president's press secretary quarantined with the coronavirus. And as I said, the death toll over 80,000. A White House in disarray, Republican senators now understanding that their fate is tied to Donald Trump, and that is scaring the hell out of them as they move towards the fall, expecting to absorb huge losses. What is planned this week for the White House? What is a president planning to do after wasting a weekend just mindlessly tweeting and retweeting throughout most of Mother's Day yesterday?
Joe, he's going to start with a news conference. It's back. He's got one today at 4 o'clock. In the Rose Garden. He's going to give an update on the nation's testing program, which, of course, has been the single matter where this administration has faced the most criticism for the lack of widespread effective testing, which is seen as, of course, the biggest obstacle to having a reopening of this nation, to have economies, state economies start to spring back to life. How hard it would be to do that without that testing. The president is going to address that this afternoon in that news conference. But there is a lot going on. Of course, that news conference is going to be held without a number of his top advisors, and medical experts who you just listed are all self-isolating, are self-quarantining after having been exposed to a staffer who had tested positive for the virus. And we've had a few staffers now who have come back with positive results, showing this reach of the virus into the West Wing. It has rattled aides. You played the clip earlier about Kevin Hassett, one of his economic advisors, saying he's scared to go into work because he's fearful of the exposure there. We have started to see over the weekend some Secret Service agents wearing masks in the West Wing, but that is still the exception. Most of the senior staff is not wearing them. The president has said he doesn't want to do that. But this is going to, the White House is going to try to keep pushing the idea of a return to normalcy. According to FAA notices, the president's going to be traveling to Pennsylvania this week for another event, like he was in Arizona last week. But there is deep worry about where this is going. There's deep worry among his inner circle about how can he make the case to Americans to restart the economy if members of his own staff, people who work in his home, have come down with the virus despite all the testing. How can he balance that with what we saw on Friday, with the historic unemployment numbers, the historic loss of jobs, which is terrifying his team, believing that there's no way he's going to be able to win a second term, defeat Joe Biden without the economy restarting. And those numbers just show the grim reality that this nation faced from coast to coast, the economic pain people are suffering, beyond, of course, the 80,000 deaths and the historic headwinds that President Trump now faces if he were to win 4 more years in office.
The Washington Post reports that amid the coronavirus crisis, President Trump is growing concerned about its growing impact on his re-election campaign. The paper reports that some of Trump's advisors have described him as glum and shell-shocked by recent polls, which have shown him trailing to Joe Biden. Quote, in private conversations, Trump has struggled to process how his fortunes suddenly changed from believing he was on a glide path to re-election to realizing that he is losing to the likely Democratic nominee in virtually every poll, including his own campaign's internal surveys, advisors told the Post. Trump is also concerned about the possibility that a second wave of the coronavirus this fall could further hurt his chances in November, according to advisors, aides, and other allies. It's not doing very well in these polls, Joe.
Well, and the Washington Post is also reporting, Bob Costa, that a lot of Republican senators are frightened by their prospects, and for good reason.
This would be a good time to speak out then.
Yeah, I mean, thanks to a combination of the shrinking economy, the president's botching of this outbreak every day, and also rising enthusiasm among Democratic voters. The Post notes that in recent weeks, Republican senators have been forced into the difficult position of touting their own response to the pandemic without overtly distancing themselves from the president, who's under scrutiny, but still also has pretty big sway with Republican voters. One Republican strategist closely involved in the Senate races told the Post, quote, "It is a bleak picture right now all across the map, to be honest with you." And, I mean, you look at these races, Bob, Republicans, I mean, if the election were held today, I find it hard to believe that Republicans don't lose Arizona, don't lose Colorado, don't lose Montana, don't lose Maine, don't lose North Carolina. And you have to look at least one of those Georgia seats that they're in danger of losing. Kansas is a real possibility if the past is prologue. This is a Republican Party in deep trouble. They know they're in deep trouble because they look to the White House for guidance, and all they've seen this weekend and since the pandemic began, chaos and mixed signals.
And, Joe, I also picked up some new reporting over the weekend talking to Republican campaign strategists. There is a growing private debate about who should be made the political foil for Republicans. If you're in a tough Senate race, do you run against China in a hardline way? But there's a lot of grumbling among some of these Republicans that the White House is not doing enough to make the case against China. They look at the president's tweets over the weekend and they see the president railing against the media, railing against some Democrats, but they don't see a forceful case day in, day out against China. And there is worry in Republican ranks that because of this pandemic and the economic recession and the possible economic depression on the horizon, they need to find some kind of political target that they all can hit in unison. But there's disagreement among some close to the president because the president still wants to keep this China trade deal afloat. He has had a relationship, as we know, with President Xi Jinping of China. So that's something to watch. How much does the Republican Party turn against China here? How much does the president? Is there a discrepancy in how they go about